let's talk about MongoDB specifically. So I have built startups that leverage MongoDB in the background for a decade now. And so I can speak about it kind of really vaguely, which is the key difference for people who are already familiar with SQL. SQL is a structured table. So it looks like when you see like an Excel spreadsheet or a Google sheet where you have specific columns with names and a certain number of rows, that is similar to how SQL tables are structured. A NoSQL database like Mongo doesn't have that structure. So
it has a structure, but it's not the tabular structure that you get in relational database. And you point on one thing, which is MongoDB has been within the space for maybe over a decade now.
Oh, yeah.
And we've been supporting startups and large enterprise organizations with just application development.
I'd also say really quickly is that Mongo is the NoSQL company. Like when I think in my own vector representation in my brain, like of meaning
Love
representation, NoSQL and Mongo, they occupy the same location in my internal vector space.
That's very good. And I'm hoping after this conversation, you're going to see MongoDB as the database for your AI application. And you can make that, and that takes up another, I guess, space within the latent space of your brain.
Mm-hmm. Nice, yeah. And so, sorry, I interrupted you as you were about to explain how NoSQL database differs from a relational database like SQL.
Yeah. So relational database or use data stored in that tabular format. So you have rows and columns, and relational databases they've been within the whole space since the 80s. So they work well for the use cases and some of the applications that are built. Well, MongoDB is a database that is based on the document data model, which essentially you're storing data in key value pairs. And one thing that resonated with a lot of startup developers when back in the early days of MongoDB was how easy it was to get started with MongoDB, and how when you use the MongoDB database, it reflects how the developers think, which is in that JSON-like structure. And for me, it was a very, very massive moment in my career. And I don't think I touched on it the last time I was on this podcast, but I was a full stack web developer about maybe 7 years ago. But I used to hate programming. But I fell in love with programming because MongoDB made it easier for me to think about the stack. So I was a front-end developer, but when I understood, when I took MongoDB on the data layer, and I saw that I can represent the data in the application layer in the same way within the data layer, which is that JSON structure I was talking about, that document data model, everything clicked. It changed my career, and I became a mean stack developer, right? A full stack developer using the mean stack to build web application.
Yeah, and so MEAN, M-E-A-N, it's an acronym where each of those letters represents a different layer in the stack, and the M is MongoDB, right?
Exactly.
It's the base of the stack.
And the E was Express, and A was Angular, and N was Node.js, and it was actually Angular.js, then you have the Angular. So before Angular that we have now, there was another library called Angular.js, which was a whole, much harder to work with.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I remember as to why we went with Mongo databases way back, this would be about 2014, we were making database decisions, so 11 years ago. And one of the reasons why we went with Mongo and this kind of NoSQL JSON-like structure, key value pairs that you're describing, is that it allows you to have way more flexibility. So a given part of your application, of your website, you might not know for sure long-term what information you're going to have on that page or in that part of the application. And so MongoDB makes it really easy, instead of needing to plan in advance and be really rigid about how some data are structured or some part of your application is structured, you can just say, okay, we're going to have this key, it's going to be called this, it's going to be populated with this kind of data, and if in the future you change that, that's okay.
Yeah, and where you hit the nail on the head, firstly, is in you hit the nail, you said it very well. And we're seeing the same thing within AI today. So the AI space is moving incredibly fast. I think that's an understatement, right? It felt like yesterday ChatGPT came out, and it was just 2 years ago ChatGPT came out in November 2022. But one thing that we do at MongoDB is we have that document data model, which allows you to have a flexible schema, right? Which means that as your understanding of the requirement of your application evolves, your data layer can evolve with it. But at the same time, once you have a stable understanding of the data representation that you want the way data is represented within the application layer, you can actually lock your schema in MongoDB. So it gives you that fixed structure once you go into production, but you get the flexibility once you're experimenting, which is what a lot of people are doing with AI today. So they need that flexible data structure. They need what MongoDB brings.
Makes perfect sense. Something that I'm kind of thinking off the top of my head, if you were building some kind of application that leveraged LLMs today, you might be experimenting with calling different LLM models. Sometimes you're calling an OpenAI API, sometimes you're calling Cohere.
Yes.
Other times you have your own llama-based model running on your own infrastructure. And so you might have, depending on which LLM you're calling, even if your user experience is remaining relatively consistent, under the covers, you might have different fields. Like maybe when you're calling your llama LLM, it has different outputs. Maybe it has some additional field that you don't have when you're calling the OpenAI API.
Yeah.
And so Mongo allows you to very flexibly, under the hood, just be like, okay, we're going to store that extra information. Whereas if you were trying to do everything in the tabular way, you would have had to have already had that column in place
Yes.
for that LLM that you ended up using later on.
Yes, and we have, and one thing is, again, we have a lot of evolving and experimentation happening within AI workload today. And having a rigid schema, having to do schema migration just because something's changed in your applications, in your application space that you didn't realize at the beginning, it causes a lot of pain for developers, right? And in the age of AI that we're in today, speed is a competitive advantage, right? Enabling your developer productivity is a competitive advantage. So if you have a flexible database and you have MongoDB, it allows your developers to move a lot quicker. And we also realized that we also wanted these LLMs to give us structured output. So we have the structured output in OpenAI, or JSON mode is what most of the LLMs have. And that resonates with what we were talking about earlier, which is what resonated for developers like yourself 10 years ago was, hey, JSON makes a lot of sense in the application layer. Now it makes sense in the data layer. MongoDB right now, if you look at it, we have LLMs enabled in JSON mode. Now your LLMs, it's just a way to think of the whole AI stack in a unified manner. And you think about JSON in your application layer, you think about JSON in your data layer, you think about JSON in your LLM. It just makes everything easier.